So, hello, and I'm going to begin. And I know that I'm betting. Suzanne and I have a bet. We're betting that nobody here looked at the videos, right? Right. So we are actually tonight going to play the video because in the previous weeks, I have felt like I could give you the background and it would be fine. But I think that this week the video is integral to a discussion. So it's going to be the first half hour or so video. But before that, I want to read to you something that was out, put out in the background material. But even before that, I want to ask where you were last Friday at 2 p.m. Israel time, what you were doing. So that was when the court in The Hague came down with their preliminary findings and their ruling. And what I would say about the lecture today is that I believe everything you're going to hear from Yossi Klein Halevi today, you can make a direct line from that to what happened last week on last Friday in the court. And so I would think that what we'll talk about is both what he said, what his points are about how anti-Semitism in America has became like what the path was for it anti-Semitism to become anti-Zionism to become anti-Semitism, and what forms that takes now and how that's different even than maybe a couple months ago. But to get us started, I want to read to you the UN resolution 3379 from 1975. How many of you remember when this happened? Was probably quite, how many of you were in Israel when it happened? Yeah, I'd love to. Do you remember what that was like? Or do you remember people's reaction? You're on mute. Edna.
I don't remember the resolution itself, but it was after Yom Kippur, so I'm trying to tie things together.
Let me read it to you all. Recalling its resolution 1904 of 20 November 1963. I'm gonna skip some parts of it. Proclaiming the United Nations Declaration on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and in particular, its affirmation that any doctrine of racial differentiation or superiority is scientifically false, morally condemnable, socially unjust, and dangerous, and its expression of alarm at the manifestations of racial discrimination still in evidence in some areas of the world, some of which are imposed by certain governments by means of legislative, administrative, or other measures. So that's the beginning piece, its opening, recalling also that in its resolution of 3151 of 14 December 1973, the General Assembly condemned the unholy alliance between South African racism and Zionism. So I want you to sort of hear that this week, right? South African racism and Zionism. Taking note of the Declaration of Mexico on the Equality of Women and their contribution to development and peace, 1975, proclaimed by the World Conference, blah, blah, blah. International cooperation and peace require the achievement of national liberation and independence, the elimination of colonialism and neocolonialism, foreign occupation, wait for it, Zionism, apartheid, and racial discrimination in all its forms, as well as the recognition of the dignity of all peoples and their right to self-determination. This is in this resolution. Taking also note also of the resolution 77 adopted by the Assembly of the Head of States of Governments of African Unity in 75, that the racist regime in occupied Palestine and the racist regime in Zimbabwe and South Africa have a common imperialist origin. forming a whole and having the same racist structure and being organically linked in their policy aimed at repression of the dignity and integrity of the human being. Taking also note of the political declaration and strategy to strengthen international peace and security and to intensify solidarity and mutual assistance among non-aligned countries adopted at the Conference of Ministers of Foreign Affairs in August of 75, which most severely condemned Zionism as a threat to the world peace and security. All right, here's the line. Called upon all countries to oppose this racist and imperialist ideology, determines that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. Zionism is racism. 1975. That is the UN resolution. What we're going to learn a little bit about in this video is how we got there at the UN and how this really has influenced society since, before. But we're going to do it through the story of one professional Jew. How many of you have learned with my teacher, Yossi Klein Halevi, before? Okay, so the brief background is Yossi is an incredible writer and teacher. He right now is a senior fellow at the Hartman Institute, but has written many books. His most recent book is Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. He also is quite an official, he is like, when I went to build my list of songs that I was going to do last week in my sermon, I ended up looking at 88 different songs before I chose the 5 that I talked about. But he was my first go-to. Dear Yossi, what are you listening to now? He began his life in the United States and aligned himself as a young yeshiva bacher kahanist.
Mm-hmm.
He's done such incredible 180 from that, as I spent time marching with him from his class, marching up to the Knesset this past summer in the anti-judicial reform, anti-Netanyahu marches this summer. He speaks widely and hosts a podcast that I encourage you to listen to called For Heaven's Sake. How many of you listened to For Heaven's Sake?
I listened once or twice.
So he does this podcast with Rabbi Dr. Danielle Hartman, and they used to do it before October 7th with Dr. Rabba Alana Stein-Hain, and now they're doing it twice a week, 20 minutes each, to give you where they are updates. So I thought that, I've forgot all 8 sessions. I said, oh, if you see the video or not, it's up to you. But this one, I wanted you to see the video. So we're going to play the video. I hope you learned something and enjoy it. And Suzanne's amazing at being able to do this because I don't know how to do this. I hope it works.
Generation, my life was intended to be a victory over anti-Semitism. We were the miracle children who should not have been born. Our very existence proved the limited reach, even of a total war of genocide. We were given the names of murdered grandparents and told to be happy. Our happiness would be the final vindication of our parents' survival. And yet, our lives were our parents' victory, not ours. Of course, we did nothing to earn our birth. And so growing up, I was determined to earn my own victory over anti-Semitism. My childhood and youth were defined by the need to prove my worth in the struggle to protect the Jewish people. In 6th grade, together with friends whose parents were likewise survivors, I formed the Anti-Nazi Agency. We had read in our Brooklyn Jewish newspaper that neo-Nazi groups were on the rise, and that it was only a matter of time before the complacent American Jewish community was confronted with the very threat that had destroyed the complacent German Jewish community. We mimeographed leaflets that mimicked the language of our Jewish newspaper, warning of a rising Nazi tide, this hyper language, and hung them on lampposts. We collected several hundred signatories on a petition demanding that President Lyndon Johnson outlaw Nazi groups, and we mailed it to the White House. Years later, as a graduate student in journalism, I met my first real Nazis on a class assignment to the Chicago headquarters of the Nazi Party. The actual assignment was to write about any local Chicago community organization, and I chose the American Nazi Party. Here at last was my chance to confront childhood demons. Now, this was in 1977, and the mainstream media was suddenly focused on a homegrown American Nazi threat, the Nazi Party's intention to march into the Chicago suburb of Skokie, home of a substantial community of survivors. For me, it was one of those moments in life of thrilling coincidence. Here I was in Chicago with a pretext to actually go meet Nazis. I sat in their swastika-covered clubhouse and listened to their leader, a strutting little man with a long nose named Frank Collin, and he warned about the all-powerful Jews. And yet, I didn't feel fear or danger or even, strange enough to say, loathing. Instead, I felt amused. I looked around the room and saw not stormtroopers, but a collection of losers who belonged in Mel Brooks's film, The Producers. And Frank Collin, by the way, was later exposed as half Jewish and expelled from the party and then sent to prison for child molestation. Now, the experience that day only confirmed for me the absurdity of my childhood obsession with literal Nazis. The Nazis had exceeded their own darkest fantasies, but their capacity to threaten the Jewish people was spent. What more could they possibly do to us? And so instead of fighting my father's ghosts, the real struggle against anti-Semitism in my time was the movement to save Soviet Jewry. And that became the cause to which I dedicated my teenage years. The most powerful totalitarian empire had declared war against Jewish identity. Jews were forbidden to learn anything about Judaism, and yet Soviet anti-Semitism prevented them from entirely assimilating. And when asked permission to emigrate, Jews were expelled to the margins of society or else imprisoned. The Soviet Union called itself the leader of the world's progressive forces. And so the threat to Jewish well-being in my generation came from the left, not the right. The Holocaust presented a vexing dilemma to anti-Semites: how to restore respectability to Jew hatred after Auschwitz. And it was the Soviet Union which provided the answer. The truly inspired solution devised by the Soviets was to turn the Jews into the new Nazis. The problem was no longer Jewish weakness and morality, which Hitler despised and feared as threats to humanity's capacity to survive the Darwinian war of the jungle. Now, the threat to humanity was Jewish power and Jewish racism. The Nazis' enemy, international Jewry, was replaced by the Soviets' enemy, international Zionism. In Soviet newspapers, cartoons showed the Star of David merging with the swastika, and Israeli General Moshe Dayan merging with Hitler. The Zionists had collaborated with the Nazis and now were mimicking, no, exceeding Nazi aggression and cruelty. The Soviet gift to Jew haters was to redeem them from the stigma of racism. We don't hate Jews because we're racist. We hate Jews because they're racist. In creating the ideology of Zionism as racism, the Soviets transformed the nature of anti-Semitic threats. No longer the swastika, but the transformation of the Star of David into the swastika. The high point in the Soviet Union's war against the Jews was the 1975 UN Zionism is Racism resolution. That resolution, initiated by the Soviet bloc, labeled the movement for Jewish empowerment as inherently racist and Israel as an apartheid regime. Those accusations, which of course are commonplace today on many campuses around the world, were born in the Soviet Union's laboratory for the new anti-Semitism. The Zionism Racism Resolution clarified for me the unique nature of anti-Semitism among the various forms of racism. More than the mere hatred of the other, anti-Semitism went a considerable step further by turning the Jews into the Jew, symbol for whatever a given civilization defines as the ultimate expression of evil. And so, under pre-Holocaust Christianity, the Jew was Christ killer. Under Marxism, the Jew was capitalist. Under Nazism, race polluter. And now, in the era of universal human rights, the Jewish state became the embodiment of racism and colonialism, the most loathsome qualities of our time. Now, of course, those other more prosaic expressions of hatred for Jews persisted. The anti-Semitism of otherness. Jews were cheap or ostentatious, shabby in their poverty or vulgar in their wealth, clannish or pathetically inept in their attempts to infiltrate Gentile society. But those expressions of anti-Semitism, it seemed to me, were within the bounds of ordinary human contempt for differences. Only the anti-Semitism that turned Jews into the Jew risked becoming lethal. The purpose of the Zionism as Racism campaign was to condition the world to the necessity of destroying the Zionist state, a precursor to genocide. Zionism racism readjusted my emotional response to anti-Semitism. Mere dislike of Jews no longer especially troubled me. My focus shifted to the truly existential threat of the anti-Semitism of symbols. What kept me from feeling despair in the face of this latest incarnation of potentially lethal anti-Semitism was that this time the Jews weren't alone. The Zionism Racism Resolution was almost unanimously repudiated across American society and even in Western Europe. And the campaign to free Soviet Jews was drawing significant non-Jewish support. Senator Henry Jackson mobilized Congress to link American trade credits for the Soviet regime with levels of Soviet Jewish immigration. Christian clergy and civil rights leaders have been part of the Soviet Jewry protest movement from its first days. Meanwhile, America was becoming the most welcoming diaspora that Jews had ever known. The last barriers to Jewish acceptance were falling in academia. Even restricted country clubs were opening their doors to Jews. I married Sarah, a convert to Judaism, a descendant from a Mayflower pilgrim, and from Peter Stuyvesant, the Dutch governor who tried to bar Jews from New York, surely one of history's least successful attempts at ethnic cleansing. Thanks to Sarah, Peter Stuyvesant has Jewish progeny. The disparity in experience between my father's generation and mine was so vast that the difference between us should have been measured in centuries rather than mere decades. When Sarah and I moved to Israel in 1982, it was arguably as the freest and most privileged Jews in history, choosing to leave the most successful diaspora community for a sovereign Jewish state. In the fall of 1989, the Soviet Union began to collapse. Working as a journalist, I tracked the falling Soviet dominoes. I was in Poland when Solidarity came to power, in Prague as the Velvet Revolution triumphed. In Berlin, I saw the wall break open and felt an emotion I never thought possible, a shared sense of joy with Germans. The Iron Curtain parted, and hundreds of thousands of Soviet immigrants were on their way to Israel. Back home, I found a country that had become instantly transformed. Unemployed classical musicians played on the streets. Schoolrooms were crammed with 40 or more children. Cyrillic letters appeared on dairy products in the supermarket. This was the face of victory. For me, the most symbolic moment came in 1991, when the UN voted to repeal the Zionism racism resolution, a reparation made possible by the fall of the Soviet Union. With that implicit apology to the Jewish people, the UN seemed to confirm the historic defeat of the anti-Semitism of symbols. True, in large parts of the Muslim world, pathological Jew hatred had become endemic. Hitler's Mein Kampf and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion were runaway bestsellers for decades in Arab countries. Arab state media routinely broadcast anti-Semitic messages that combined medieval themes of Jewish bloodlust with Nazi themes of Jewish world domination. And yet, there was hope for that sickness too. The Oslo peace process held the promise of ending the Palestinian conflict, one of the main sources of contemporary Muslim anti-Semitism. Now, of course, there would always be people who would hate Jews as other. But that was the mere anti-Semitism of dislike. Only the anti-Semitism of symbols truly threatened our existence. And the war against lethal anti-Semitism was on its way to being won. And now it's back. The return of obsessive Jew hatred was not supposed to happen. The Holocaust should have shamed humanity into an unconditional rejection of anti-Semitism. And with a thriving Jewish state and a self-confident American Jewry and the disappearance of the Soviet Union, history seemed to be pointing toward that historic reckoning. In retrospect, of course, it was foolish to assume that the Holocaust could end lethal Jew hatred, that unleashing the ultimate demons would somehow exhaust them. The opposite has happened. By actualizing the inconceivable, the Holocaust created new norms. If European soccer fans chant Jews to the ovens, and Iranian leaders lead masses of the faithful in chanting death to Israel, it's because the Holocaust happened. The renewal after the Holocaust of passionate anti-Semitism, as opposed to its merely casual forms, is in some sense even more shocking than the Holocaust itself. Now we know where this hatred can lead, yet the infection is spreading and generating new rationales. The resurrection of anti-Semitism after Auschwitz is arguably its greatest achievement, testimony to its extraordinary adaptability. The Soviet Union is dead, but anti-Zionism is its posthumous victory. The UN may have formally repudiated the Zionism racism resolution, yet its impact has only grown. The UN's hatred for the Jewish state is stunning. More resolutions are passed against Israel than against all other countries combined. As UN Watch, a pro-Israel NGO, starkly put it, A nation with 0.1% of the world's population draws 78% of UN condemnations. The obsessive hatred of Israel recalls an old and familiar obsession. Only Israel is the target of an international boycott movement. Only Israel, among all the nations of our otherwise morally exemplary world, must defend the legitimacy of its existence. Only Israel. We have too easily adapted to those terrible words. Thanks in large part to social media, we face an unprecedented globalization of anti-Semitism. YouTube clips about Jewish conspiracies attract millions of viewers. And even the Nazis are back, this time not merely threatening to march through a Jewish neighborhood, but massacring worshipers in synagogues. On October 27, 2018, I was visiting a synagogue in suburban Chicago when the news came from Pittsburgh. The initial report was that a far-left gunman denouncing Trump's support for Israel had entered the Tree of Life synagogue. That report made sense to the Chicago congregants. Earlier that same week, a man shouting about Palestinian oppression had threatened to kill children playing in the synagogue's school. The shooter, of course, turned out to be a neo-Nazi, outraged by support for migrants. In the following days on a lecture tour, I participated in memorial services around Jewish America. American Jews, I realized, were telling two very different stories about Pittsburgh. One story was American, one story was Jewish, and each had a different geographical trajectory. The points along the American story were Charlottesville, Charleston, Thousand Oaks, Las Vegas, Pittsburgh. That was a story about gun control, about mindless violence, about a reckless and inciting president, generic racism. This time it was a synagogue, but it could have been a black church or a mosque. The second story American Jews told about Pittsburgh was Jewish, and its geographical trajectory included Paris, Toulouse, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Buenos Aires, Pittsburgh. This was a story about the return of violent Jew hatred around the world, and which had finally come to America. As an Israeli, I felt confused and even alienated by the American story of Pittsburgh. At one memorial service, I heard a rabbi dedicate the closing Kaddish to all victims of guns. Jews are murdered praying in a synagogue, and your takeaway is gun control. I realized that we were speaking very different languages. When Jewish leaders at these gatherings spoke about bringing the community together in mourning, they weren't speaking only of the Jewish community, but also of their non-Jewish neighbors. And this was also disorienting for me as an Israeli. Who are you, American Jews? Where does your emotional center lie? And yet, I gradually understood that both stories were true to the Pittsburgh moment. Listening to the non-Jewish speakers at the memorial services, what I heard wasn't expressions of solidarity with the Jewish community, but empathy. An attack on an American synagogue was an attack on America, on all Americans. That's what they were saying. We stand here with you, not in solidarity, but as fellow mourners. I recently visited Pittsburgh and was struck by the still pervasive sense of grief. Jews still seemed stunned. The rabbi of the Tree of Life, Jeffrey Myers, spoke very slowly and seemed to barely move his lips as he recounted that morning to me. The synagogue remained closed. A barrier of police tape was wrapped around the building. But what struck me most were the memorial signs that still hung in store windows. Across from the Tree of Life was a handwritten poster on a fence. We love our neighbors. In my hotel lobby hung a poster with a Star of David. Now, the normative Israeli response to Pittsburgh was, you see, American Jews thought they were home just like German Jews. But in the end, America is no different from every other exile. And yet, the outpouring of non-Jewish grief over Pittsburgh proved otherwise. The aftermath of Pittsburgh revealed that despite Pittsburgh, America is still different. I hate anti-Semitism. I hate what it does psychologically and spiritually to us as a people and to me as an individual. I feel infantilized by rage, sullied by intimate exposure to the most unevolved members of the human race. I feel my creativity co-opted by their fantasies, my energy distracted by the need to refute their inane accusations. Jew hatred leaks into my soul, drags me back into my fevered childhood. And yet, it's far healthier to deal with reality than to wish it away. And so for the first time in decades, books on anti-Semitism and the Holocaust once again fill my most accessible shelves. They include books I admire, like Alon Confino's A World Without Jews, and David Nirenberg's Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition, both of which make the case for the uniqueness of anti-Semitism among hatreds. And they include books I admire less, like Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, which relativizes and diminishes the Holocaust. Like so many of us, I am trying to understand this moment, what it means, why it happened, how to respond. My starting point is a question that is currently dividing much of American Jewry. Which is the greater threat, the far right or the far left? The question is not trivial. How one answers can determine which non-Jews are considered appropriate allies in the fight against anti-Semitism. The answer depends in part on where the question is being asked. In America today, the most immediate and lethal danger clearly emanates from the far right. When word came of a shooter in the Chabad synagogue in Poway, we instinctively knew he was a young white male who spent too much time on Nazi websites. Still, that profile could change. The next attack, God forbid, could come from radical Islamists. Say a Hezbollah sleeper cell operated by Iran and responding to a crisis in the Middle East, similar to the terrorists who blew up AMIA, the central Jewish community building in Buenos Aires in 1994. In France, despite the growing strength of the far right, the lethal threat to Jews comes primarily from radical Islamists. In Poland and Hungary, Jews fear a resurgent far right. And in Germany, they fear the far right, the far left, and Islamists. In England, the very viability of a venerable Jewish community is being threatened by a radicalized Labour Party. Over 40% of British Jews, according to a recent poll, say they would seriously contemplate emigrating if Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn becomes prime minister. As British Jews note, anti-Semitism didn't legitimize anti-Zionism in England as it did in the Soviet Union, but the opposite. By promoting obsessive hatred for the Jewish state, Corbyn has emboldened the anti-Semites, who assume that Labour's culture can now tolerate attacks not only on Zionism, but on Jews and Judaism generally. So far, they haven't been proven wrong. American Jews on the left, who are calling for focusing on the far right alone, and who downplay the dangers coming from the far left, are effectively trying to remove American Jewry from the global struggle against anti-Semitism. The far right at this moment poses the greatest danger to American Jewish lives. but the anti-Zionist left threatens the Jewish people. We Jews are a story we tell ourselves about who we think we are. That's why the seminal ritual binding most Jews today is the Passover Seder, when we gather to once again try to understand the meaning of the story we've been carrying in one form or another for 4,000 years. In declaring war against that story, the anti-Zionists seek to undermine the spiritual foundation of our existence. The anti-Zionist left has declared war against the great post-Holocaust achievement of the Jewish people, the reclamation of power. For Israelis, that process took the form of hard military power. For American Jews, the soft power of political lobbying and coalition building and strategic wielding of philanthropy. Now, both Israeli hard power and American Jewish soft power are being targeted as illegitimate. Those committed to the well-being of the Jewish people must not minimize the nature of the threats we face from any direction. Now, I confess that after Charlottesville, I dismissed American Jewish fears of the far right, recalling my own childhood obsession with Nazis. So what if a few hundred young men marched with torches? They've always been there, they always will be there, simmering on the margins. But then came Pittsburgh, and then came Poway. And in synagogues across America, Jews now anxiously glance at the entrance and wonder who might be coming. How we deal with the complexities presented by anti-Semitism will help define Jewish life in our time. Thank you.
Well, now for those of you who've missed the earlier lectures from each of the weeks, you may be enticed to want to go back and hear some of the earlier lectures. There's another half hour of this that we won't watch that you can go online and watch, which is a discussion with Yossi Kleine-Levy and Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer, now president of the Shalom Hartman Institute. Before we go into a longer discussion, I just want to go over what we think, or I think, are the enduring understandings of what he has said. He was trying to tell us, everyone heard it, right? Yeah. Yeah, that anti-Semitism is a unique form of hatred which turns the Jew into the symbol for whatever a given civilization defines as its ultimate expression of evil. So, right, there's the Jew as the Christ killer, and then there's the Jew as the anti-Marxist capitalist, and then there's the Jew polluting the gene pool, then there during Nazism, then there's the Jew during the time of Soviet Jewry up until today. Soviet Jewry created a socially acceptable form of anti-Semitism, not Soviet Jewry, but the Soviet Union, after the Holocaust by turning the Jew into the racist and spurring the Zionism as a racist movement at the UN, which I'm not sure most folks remember or know that it was the Soviet bloc who brought that about. And remember, this series was put together 5 years ago. I think it's only amplified now when he said that anti-Semitism today is found in the far right. And then he said that was what was most problematic. But a mere 5 years later, we can see it in the far left and in radical Islam. Of course, not in the right, and not in the left, and not in Islam, but in the far right and the far left and in radical. So in all of the movements that are on the edges. And for us, it's important to recognize all of its forms and to also understand that criticizing Israel in not its existence, but criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitism necessarily. So when I go through some of the texts from Natan Sharansky that were given for today, in Yossi Klein Halevi's opinion, the greatest threat facing the Jewish people is the anti-Semitic threat of anti-Zionism. I think his feelings 5 years ago may be coming a bit to fruition, in that it undermines the very essence and foundation of the Jewish story. I want to stop, and I want to tell you what I'd like to do. It was a lot of listening, so we're going to have some time for you to process. And then I'd like to go to the 5th reading. You don't need to have it up. I can read it to you. I have all the readings printed out, the one by Natan Sharansky. But before that, I'm going to stop because this is a big thesis presented, and give a few moments if anyone wants to say what they are thinking right now before we move on to Sharansky. Anyone have thoughts about what you heard from Yossi Klein Halevi? Debbie Brett, but you have to unmute. And again, this was recorded in 2019, which I guess is 4 or 5 years ago.
That was one of my questions, but
yeah.
I found this such an interesting and compelling lecture, because I knew I have taken some classes that have used some of Yossi Klein Halevi's writings before this. I don't know that there is a big difference now between how much of the anti-Semitism comes from the right or the left. I think it's there from both sides. But
very different, very different.
Yeah.
And we have to remember to say far right and far left, because there are many on this Zoom who consider themselves part of either the right or the left.
Yes,
so
I understand that, and I apologize for that. I was not intending to besmirch anybody. I just I was in Chicago and lived there during the march in Skokie. But you know,
wow.
People of my parents' generation were scared about this. And I just said, it's just a bunch of crackpots. And later on, they were made fun of in a movie. If you ever saw The Blues Brothers, which was a very funny movie, part of that movie had to do with the March of the Nazis. It's hard to know how serious to take some of these things. We can't make ourselves crazy with every expression from one person on the far left or one on the far right, criticizing Jews, criticizing Israel. I just don't think that we can get ourselves spun up that way. I think education is the key to this. I still believe that all of these young people who are marching in New York really don't know anything about, they would have trouble finding Gaza on a map. And I'm a big geography person, and they don't know how Gaza got split off from the rest of it.
Okay, thanks, Debbie. I'm gonna invite other comments. I'm also gonna say hello to Dr. Leonard, Dr. Smith, who is a new participant, but old friend of mine from Ohio. So Nancy, you'll meet him at some point. She's from Ohio. Okay. Who else would like to? Sally, who you are still in Shloshim, yes, right? Okay, we're happy to have you with us. But you are okay now,
Thank
Sally.
you. I just thought his thesis was very interesting and something I hadn't heard before. But the demonization of Jews throughout a lot of history as whatever is hated most thought that was very interesting and thought-provoking.
Yes, I will tell you, when I'm at Hartman, I don't ever care what he's teaching. I just care that he's teaching and go and listen to him. Edna, lo shomim.
Sorry. As continuing what Sally just commented and Debbie, I think I found his distinction, the sharp distinction, very illuminating when he distinguished between just disliking Jews and between the Jew, the symbolize what it stands for. And I obviously, intuitively, I would make this distinction too. There is a difference between somebody coming to say, oh, I really think that Israel is such and such, or the Jews are such and such. Okay, fine. But what he brought into the discussion, and this is the main challenge, it's the Jew and the, it's not even a change, but the different angles that are attributed all the time to the hatred of the Jew. And I thought that this distinction was a very important issue, even when you mention the Hag or the criticism of Israel/Jewish people. Everything, I think, can fall to this distinction. So this I'm going to take with me. I thought it was kind of clearing a little bit the discussion.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting, by the way, that I'm glad that an Israeli said the Chag, because when you hear Israelis talk about the Hague, that's how they call the Hague. They call it the Chag. And so if you listen,
a holiday?
and you'll listen to the, as I recommended, I really,
No, it's
really,
not a holiday, it was a Hague.
no, it's not the holiday.
I know, that's why I'm laughing.
You should listen to the podcast that was, I listened to, I guess, yesterday or the day before, the one that came out Monday about the verdict in The Hague was like quite painful for me to listen to. It's only 20 minutes long, and I really encourage you to listen to it. Really talking about how just these two like religious Israeli men, but modern, you don't get as any more modern than Daniel Hartman or Yossi Klein Halevi, and how shocking would it be for any individual human being to feel like they are on trial? Like if you were in trial for murder or rape, God forbid, anything, how shocking that is. But when you're on trial, your entire people for genocide, how incredibly shocking that is. And hard to hear and hard to deal with. And even if and when, right, Zionism as racism gets overturned, as he talks about the Soviet bloc falls, Zionism as racism gets overturned, but the culture of Zionism as racism, that phrase, that doesn't go away. Once it's out there, it's out there. In the same way that we knew that once this genocide charge was out there, it's out there. Even though if you go and read or listen to how the justices ruled, they didn't rule that it was genocide at all. And in fact, they said, look, we want to make sure it isn't, but they didn't say it was. And they didn't say there must be a ceasefire now. They didn't do that.
Yeah,
but it doesn't matter because it's out there. It's the story from the Talmud about Lashon Hara, the famous story that the man comes to a rabbi, and the rabbi the man wants to be forgiven for the Lashon Hara he's done, for the evil, bad talk he's done. And the rabbi said, okay, go take a feather pillow and cut it and let the feathers go everywhere and come back to me the next day. And he does. And the rabbi says to him, okay, now go collect all the feathers. which you can't. Once it's out there, it's out there. I hope this is not upsetting. I mean, this is upsetting. The world is upsetting right now, but at least we're studying together. I'd love to read some Sharansky together. It's so interesting that how many of you marched for Natan Sharansky's freedom? I am sure all of you, right? Or most of you. And then, right, the blessing of Jewish modernity was that he ends up being free and a minister in the government and a politician and a thinker. So I'm at source number 5. They were emailed to you. The sources were emailed to you. You don't need to follow. I can just read unless you want to read. I just think that some of these are just, even though it's from 2004, I think it'll really interesting. Would
What
someone else
page?
want to read? It's on page 217 of the reader. It's source 5. Hold on, I have to drink. Would someone want to read so you don't have to keep hearing my voice? Okay, I'll read. I had no volunteers. When I was a dissident in the former Soviet Union, one of my regular activities was monitoring anti-Semitism and smuggling out evidence and records of such activity to the West. I believe that the free world, particularly after the Holocaust, would always be a staunch ally in the struggle against anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, I was wrong. Today, as a minister in the Israeli government in charge of monitoring anti-Semitism, by the way, how beautiful is that he went from a refusenik to that. I find myself regularly summoning the ambassadors of West European states to protest anti-Semitic attacks on Jews in their countries, and often the meek responses of their governments. Over the past 4 years, we've witnessed a resurgence of anti-Semitic activity in the democratic world. Look when this was written. So he's talking about from the year 2000. In Europe, synagogues have been burned, rabbis have been abused in street, Jewish children have been physically attacked. I don't know, I think I told this story already, but I'll tell it again. I've been so moved about 6 weeks ago in shul on a Friday night. For any of you who are Friday night people, you're always welcome to become Friday night people. One of our congregants stood for Mourner's Kaddish at the end of the service. My custom at the end of the service is to ask who you are saying Mourner's Kaddish for. And this congregant, this woman said, I'm saying Kaddish for my father, who was murdered in Paris 15 years ago in an anti-Semitic attack. And I remember everyone in the shul was so quiet, and mostly me, because nobody there knew that. She hadn't shared that before. And it was, we think, I am like the person who thinks anti-Semitism is so far away. I'm, happy-go-lucky. But it's not. Recognizing the new anti-Semitism. The second paragraph. I want to go to his Ds. I think this is the part that is pretty interesting, his 3D test. So someone else want to read? No one's giving me a break. Okay. Moreover, the so-called new anti-Semitism poses a unique challenge. Whereas classical anti-Semitism is aimed at the Jewish people or the Jewish religion, new anti-Semitism is aimed at the Jewish state. Since this anti-Semitism can hide behind the veneer of legitimate criticism of Israel, right? And this is someone who is writing this as a minister of the government, who believes, like I believe, like many of you believe, it is okay to have legitimate criticism of a government. That's what makes it part of it, the liberal West. It is more difficult to expose. Making the task even harder is that this hatred is advanced in the name of values most of us would consider unimpeachable, such as human rights. Nevertheless, we must be clear and outspoken in exposing the new anti-Semitism. I believe we can apply a simple test. I call it the 3D test to help us distinguish legitimate criticism of Israel from anti-Semitism. By the way, this question, I don't know about you, but I get asked this question a lot. I mean, before October 7th, right? When is it okay to legitimately criticize Israel? And we believe it is. And he, as a minister in the Israeli government, believed it was. The first D is the test of demonization. When the Jewish state is being demonized, when Israel's actions are blown out of all sensible proportion, when comparisons are made between Israelis and Nazis and between Palestinian refugee camps and Auschwitz, this is anti-Semitism, not legitimate criticism of Israel. I'm going to stop there to see if people agree with that, want to argue with that, don't want to leave it there. Anyone have a modern, meaning in the last couple months, example of this?
I personally agree with him. Even from October 7, we hear criticism about Israel not being human, Israel doing this, Israel that. And it's true that there is a lot of destruction and pain, but the comparison, I agree with Sharansky, is not valid in my eyes.
Mike, then Judy, then we're going to go to his second D. Mike, do you want to say something? Mike Rosenthal? You're on mute.
I took that off. During World War II, we dropped atomic weapons on Japan, and we literally bombed Germany into the ground. In some places, the bombings were so intense that they melted the bricks on the buildings, and yet nobody said anything about killing civilians because the idea was to win the war.
Yes, and I mean, there certainly was a lot that has been written about the use of atomic weapons. I agree with you, and I agree with you for the situation, but we have to also say that we all just saw Oppenheimer, right? Like there's a sense that we don't want to drop atomic bombs everywhere. And yes, I agree with you. So thank you. Judy. Oh, you didn't have something. Okay, I'm going to go to D. The second D. The second D is the test of double standards. When criticism of Israel is applied selectively. When Israel is singled out by the United Nations for human rights abuses, while the behavior of known and major abusers such as China, Iran, Cuba, and Syria is ignored. When Israel's Magen David Adom, alone among the world's ambulance services, is denied admission to the International Red Cross, this is anti-Semitism. D. The third D is the test of delegitimization. When Israel's fundamental right to exist is denied, alone among all peoples of the world, this too is anti-Semitism. We are right now in such a difficult time for everyone here because you all have family or friends there. I feel for the person, they know who they are on this Zoom, who came into my office last week and said, I'm done. It's terrible. And I agreed with them. I'm done too. It is terrible. And we don't have a choice. Israel doesn't have a choice. So it is going to remain hard and also important for all of us to keep reading, to keep asking for, fighting for hostages to be home, to continue, as my teachers do, as the folks at the Hartman Institute do, and many others, to make sure that the Israeli government fights this just war in just ways, and to know that war is terrible. And people die, and it's terrible.
Yeah, can't get past that.
And it's a very difficult time. I'm going to stop and ask for anyone who wants to say anything before Moshe and I do one big push for you to talk to all your friends about joining Moshe and I on our fabulous Israel Solidarity trip and why you should come. I'm going to do that first, and then you can all talk about this. Our Israel Solidarity trip, I just look at the itinerary and say we are so lucky that Moshe spent so much time, Moshe, hi, with our tour provider, Keshet Educational Tours, on it. There are things like meeting with a Palestinian from Gaza. There are things like going to hospitals and meeting with injured soldiers, going to army bases and providing meals for soldiers, meeting with the families of hostages, although please God, let it be meeting with the families of former hostages by then. There will be an opportunity to go to Kibbutz Cholit. The Israel Impact Fund of our congregation has raised significant funds to help that one kibbutz. Lots of synagogues are adopting different areas of Israeli society. Ours is working with Cholit, the Israel Impact Fund, and we'll be going there to help them with their agricultural work. We've been asked, what if the agricultural work's too hard? It's okay, we'll find some logistic work for you to do, something to do. We'll have the opportunity to hear from soldiers, hear from scholars, to give back. And I always add to also spend a little bit of money in some Israeli stores because the Israeli economy is certainly hurting. We'll be able to see people like Gabriel Bar Cohen, a lone soldier who grew up at our synagogue, who was here last week, but can't wait for all of us to come and visit him there. So I'm going to stop there and say, I hope that you will come. And if you're not coming, that you will talk to some other friends. We do need 20 to make it go. We're going to open it up to non-congregants as of Friday or Sunday, one of those. Anyone want to go back to some of this material about thinking about anti-Semitism? It's so hard to think about defining anti-Semitism. And I will say, as a Judeo-optimist, do you know that term? Have you heard me use that term before? It's a Hartman term I learned. There are Judeo-optimists and Judeo-pessimists. I am always thinking like, okay, so Gam ze ya'avor, this too shall pass, and the Jewish people always survive, and Gam zu l'tova, we'll always find a way, we'll figure it out. And then there are the folks who always are inclined to say, of course they're going to attack the Jews. I was never one of course they're going to attack the Jews. I'm always about, you've heard me say this in sermons, whatever shul I've been at, more joy, less oi. And yet, there's a strong history of anti-Semitism that Yossi was able to give us some insight into. Would anyone like to speak, argue, share? And then we'll stop and we'll go on to how you're feeling this week. Anyone want to speak? Sally, are you jumping in?
Yes, so I don't want to say very much, but I have very mixed feelings. I actually thought about going on the trip, and then I read about Palestinian mothers of newborns trying to find clean water and formula for their babies, and I said, no, I can't go. It's a terrible time. That's all I
It
guess
is a terrible time. And one thing I would say is I think that we all have to remember that there was a ceasefire before. There can be a ceasefire after. And they need to let our hostages out and there will be a ceasefire. And yes, it is terrible on all sides. And I understand that some people feel like this isn't the time they could go. I get that totally. Totally. And that's the thing. Yes, we want to be the moral people that make sure every Palestinian baby has formula and clean diapers. Of course. Yes. Okay. Od mishahi o mishahu. Anyone else want to speak? Edna and then Mike. Edna.
I'll make it short, but I think that it's following also Klein distinctions that with the rise of Islamic hate, to Israel that evolved in different ways in the last 100 years.
Yeah.
October 7, at least that's what I am struggling now, hit me that it's not just hating the idea of a Zionist state. It's really anti-Semite feelings that were bubbling through education and professed with the slaughtering and rape, etc., getting into houses. And the whole idea of the pogrom, not a war, a pogrom against individuals in their own houses, kind of evoke in me kind of an earthquake, how to understand or to even educate myself how deep is the hatred here. It's not just a matter of political conflict on land. It's beyond that. This is how I feel right now. Okay, so I just wanted to share the problematic of the shifting of kind of the, I don't know.
Yes, the earth has shifted under many American and Israeli Jews. The earth is shifting. And I feel that like what we need to be is very kind to each other while we're figuring this all out. But it feels to many of us, who are the allies that we had? Who will our allies be? What are the narratives? I want to say that I read this incredible article on Monday that if anyone would like, I will share with you by Rabbi Erwin Kula, the founder, former head of Klal, about the trauma between the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians that's over 100 years old, and that how we have to sort of learn, we'll have to, all of us on each side, learn to see the trauma in the other before we'll ever start a real healing. And the enormity of that seems so hard. I heard from a rabbi friend who was telling me about an imam that they are close with. And the imam was talking about how they're from Lebanon and how Lebanon borders on Palestine. Think about that. Right. So they're not talking about having two states, a Jewish state for the Jews in one part and a Palestinian state in one part, but all of it. And my relatives and friends not there, being there. So that's, yeah, it's, yeah. Tamshichi.
Just to add, it doesn't mean that the earthquake took away the dream of peace and new Middle East that once we dreamt about. And it takes me to today, that there was Gilui Matzeva to the peacenik from Be'eri, the one from Canada.
So Gilui Matzeva, there was the unveiling of a
yes. What's her name? Oh, I even
Vivian.
And obviously, the Neshot HaShalom, the organization of Arab Israeli women and the Israeli, everybody came. So it doesn't take away the dreams that we can still maybe one day build industrial park on the border with the Gazian and having a world of peace. I'm talking now about the issue of anti-Semitism and hatred and the power of what it takes us to do.
And so, how hard it will be to...
I don't want to be misunderstood. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, of course, I'm sorry.
The dream of peace exists and bubbles through songs and culture and soul. So this has nothing to do with the other.
But there still will have to be, a lot of building towards that. So next week we will not be meeting, and we will meet the week after, and hopefully there will be some changes in the world, but we're going to move on from here about thoughts about what peoplehood could mean. You already have the readings now for in 2 weeks, so you'll be able to have 2 weeks to work on the next readings. And now we can turn off the